Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight is Wednesday, October 23rd, 2019, and this is RealTuners Radio. Frequently, our listeners have been asking us about chassis and suspension tuning. So tonight, we're honored to have as our guests some of the absolute best in the business. Their work can be seen in and on literally every door class of drag racing, on Cars at No Mercy and Lights Out, Drag Week, and literally everywhere in between. Tonight, we welcome Mike and Todd Braasch from TRZ Motorsports. They have some basic concepts to go over, and we'll also welcome questions from the listeners. So tighten those belts, pull down your visor, pull the pins, and get ready. This is RealTuners Radio. You guys are live. What's going on?
How you doing?
Oh, hey, everybody.
Yeah,
what's up, guys?
Does his thing.
Welcome back, everybody.
I'm just waiting for all you guys to say all your what's happening and what's going on and who's here. And so everybody, welcome back to episode 101 of RealTuners. Yes, we know that the signage up on YouTube and Facebook says episode 100 with the gold leaf and all of that, but we wanted to keep that there a little bit, if for no other reason than we have really two guys who are some of the stars of building the parts and supplying the service and expertise that's allowing all these cars to go so fast these days. And that would be Mike and Todd Braasch of TRZ Motorsports. Guys, we are so happy to have you on.
Thank you. We're happy to be here and hopefully clear up a few misconceptions that might be happening out there.
So it's possible that there are misconceptions about cars and tuning suspension and getting a car to run fast. Who would have thought? Anyway, so without going any further, the first thing we'd love you guys to do, and you can kind of decide amongst yourselves as to how to do this, is tell us just a little bit about where did TRZ Motorsports come from? Where'd you guys get the idea to do this? And what are you doing these days?
All right. Well, it's fairly a long story, but I'll keep it very short here. So TRZ Motorsports, the TRZ is actually the original owner's initial. So his name was Tommy Z, we'll say. Lots of people know him. He's been missing in the racing scene for quite a while. But anyway, he started the business back in like 1990, 1991. Myself and Todd, we were customers of his. We were up in Chicago. We hung out at the shop, always hanging out with the people with the cars that he worked on, followed those type of people. Essentially what happened, I got a job there, started kind of running the company while I was there, had to quit, moved to Florida. About a year later, he wanted no part of it. We bought the business, moved it to Florida, and basically rebuilt it, into what it is now, which I would say we mainly focus in the stock suspension area, primarily drag radial, but that doesn't mean that we can't do anything else out there. That's just kind of where our passion, I would say, is. So, over 15 years, we've done a lot of new parts, but we've done lots of hands-on stuff. Again, drag radial stuff. We helped Eric Kenward a lot. First car on any radial anywhere, unless maybe there was a no-time car back in the day, to do a 1/1960 foot, which sounds slow as hell.
Slow.
Yeah,
that's broke.
Yeah, exactly. Now you go at 119 and you're like, God, what a turd. But we helped with that. Then, we were hands-on. Jamie Stanton, first 275 car, again, outside of maybe the no time world that people don't know. But first car on 275 would go at 109 60 foot. That was a big deal. Again, that's kind of slow now, but
it's still decent.
Yeah, it's fine. But it's just kind of the stuff that we do. We are hands-on. We know how to make the cars work, but on the other hand of it, you gotta have everyone else like you guys that can, do the power management where it needs to be. We can help with that, but you have to work hand in hand with it. So.
I just want to say, I think it's hilarious that you guys say 109 60 foot is slow. We got guys who struggle to get down in the 120s and 130s sometimes, that those are the primary crowd that we get, is that hobby racer who's just trying to figure it out. And some of those things to get those guys down to that 109 60 foot is what we're looking for tonight.
Yeah, I mean, it takes power to. I mean, it's not everybody. A 600 horsepower car is not going 1.0s. I mean, we're just like an X car.
So you guys at the intro mentioned something about misconceptions. And are there a couple of things that, again, coming from the stock suspension world, primarily radial, although you guys do a lot of grudge cars and a lot of grudge cars are running something other than radials. What are the top 3 misconceptions that are the things that the phone rings and here we go again? What are the things you'd like to tell this audience so that, they can be a little more focused on how to get their program going better?
I'll take the first one. One common one I'd say is, there's actually such a thing as too much travel and too loose of a front shock. We have guys all the time where it'll spin and they're loosening up the front, but sometimes watching the slow-mo video, you can see that front shot, the front jumped up the full travel super fast, bounces way back down like a basketball and it's spun, or we tell them to tighten up the shock and they think we're crazy, but you got to tighten it up and slow that travel so it doesn't jump up the full travel in a tenth of a second. Sometimes you need it to take 3, 4, 5, even we have guys going 1.2, 1.3 seconds till it reaches full travel, depending on what that travel is. So one of the common things is if you spin, they loosen it. Sometimes that's not always the case. I mean, sometimes it is if the shock was already too tight, but a lot of times they're just jumping up full travel, hitting that, bouncing back down, and blows the back tires off. So I'd say that's one of the common ones that sometimes people think are crazy on, but it works.
So to unpack that one a little bit, what are the things that people can look for other than like the front end comes up and you hear a big clunk? What other things are sort of the clue for people when they're looking at, do I got to make adjustments in the back? Do I got to make adjustments in the front? And is there a routine for people that you suggest when they're trying to get it sorted as to where to start and how to walk through that?
I mean, obviously it's a whole package, like you can have the front set up pretty good, and if the back's not right, it's not, something's going to be wrong. Tire pressure, there's a ton of things that go into it. Power management, like Mike was saying, is big. Everything can be perfect, but if you're trying to just bring it in too fast or too slow, sometimes you'll have issues. Converter. But a big thing is actually if you can have somebody video from the back corner of the car to be able to see the front tire and back tire at the same time that you can watch in slow-mo, that tells you a lot, also race pack and data, all that kind of stuff, obviously, but a slow-mo video tells a lot.
Well, yeah, like a lot of people forget that pretty much everyone has a smartphone. If you've got a smartphone, you've generally got a slow motion video camera in your pocket that you forget that you can actually use at the racetrack. We use it all the time. I used to have a handheld camera that we would use. The iPhone technology and the Android stuff has gotten so good that anything like that's obsolete. You just pull this thing out of your pocket. You have half of the data that you need while you're standing on the starting line. And that works for, guys that are running 10-0s can learn a lot of stuff because a lot of people will be like, we'll talk to them and they'll go, well, every time I let off the button, this thing just immediately blows the tire off. Like, okay, well, that could be, but usually it's not the case. But there's a big difference of if it truly spins right when you let off the button or if it spins in 8 inches after you let off the button, because, that's gives the car enough time to kind of, react to what's happening, start to move. And then when it spins, it's a totally different situation if it's spinning in 8 inches, or it is truly spinning right on the hit. So, and a phone takes good enough video that you can learn exactly what it's doing, and it's generally free for most people because you already have it.
Yeah, you might see that tire fold over itself, and that's what a lot of times you don't feel that in the car, but in the slow-mo video, we're on a shock sensor, but you can see that tire fold over and balloon back out and spin. And sure, it probably feels like you spun right away, but a lot of times they just overhit the tire for whatever reason.
So one of the really cool things you guys did in preparation for this evening was you sent us links for 3 videos, and we're ready whenever you want us to pull up whichever video you might think would be a good illustration of some of those thoughts, because I know we've got, having previewed them, we've got rear suspension and front suspension video from those. You said something else a second ago that's really interesting. You said people say I blew the tire off immediately, but a lot of times it really didn't. It was a hook then spin situation, even if it was only 8 inches or 2 feet or that kind of difference. What's the difference in what they're looking at when they get, if in fact they got immediate spin versus that hook then spin? And you've talked about one, which is the rate of rise on the front, but what else should people be looking at with their iPhone video?
So the videos are labeled as Eric Kenward, Frank Memshaw, and Robert Rogers, and pick which one you want by the name so that Scott knows which one to load up.
Okay, that's fine. I mean, with what we're talking about, the Robert Rogers video would probably be best to illustrate what's happening on the starting line.
That's the rear one.
Yeah, that one basically, it's an undercar video of what's happening with rear suspension, all the way through a run. I think I haven't watched it in a little while, but it'll show everything that happens. Yeah, this again, it's a drag radial car. I'd say this car is probably 8th mile time. I think when this video was taken, I was probably going 5.0s. So for Ultra Street, it's now not all that fast, but at
the time this one won the race.
Yeah, exactly. So 5.0s, for some people that might not be able to do it, that's a car that should run maybe 760, something like that, if it's going to be a quarter-mile car. But like, to get back to what you're saying, if you let off the button and truly it spins immediately, and the first thing that you have to look at really is going to be tire pressure. I would say tire pressure is going to be the biggest player on the starting line. Maybe, if anything, second behind power. If you just truly overpower the racetrack, you don't stand a chance. So you do have to be able to read the track a little bit. But again, we talk stock suspension is, like I said, what we do a lot of. In this video, what you can see is you can actually, if you watch it, you can see this thing hit the tire off the starting line, and then start separating as it goes down track. I mean, that's generally the way that it goes with drag radials. There's a few people out there that have done some magic to make it work in the other direction, but for the most part, if you want to go fast, you're going to be hitting the tire and driving the body apart, and it needs to be controlled. So, controlling it from the immediate release of the button all the way through 100 feet into the run, depending on the power that you're making, can be tricky for people, but that's where power management comes in. That's a key player in, once you leave the starting line, it needs to have the power management there to make sure that you're not overpowering it at any point in time, but that the power application is smooth, from start until you run out of power and you just have to ride along with it.
Yeah, so for everybody who's watching this on the various channels, so YouTube is running just a little bit ahead of the Facebook feed, but you're seeing a blue notchback nitrous car, and then it cuts to underneath for those of you on Mixler or might be visually impaired. Hey, Dan, I know you're on tonight. You're watching from the rear. This has got coilover suspension, and you can see some really nice stuff in the sense that the car loads the tire, but in slow-mo, you can see that it is a gradual load and the tire spins. And this guy's running OG Mickey Thompson's on it, so it's not even Radial Pros or anything. So it just you can see the separation, and the car just leaves. And if you're kind of looking, you realize, 5 seconds goes quick, even on a video like this.
So why don't you walk us through the power management you're using as this car goes down the track? Because I noticed that the track isn't the smoothest track. And are you using power management as the track changes?
I mean, sometimes you do have to. This I think this was in Orlando. Was that where I was looking at?
Yeah, that was Orlando before they redid the
Yeah, so
track,
this
right?
was back when, before they resurfaced the track out here. And he's in the left lane, so it probably wasn't too terrible. The right lane had a pretty big dip in it. But, you do get to points on some tracks where you will hit some bumps and stuff. I mean, generally what we'll do, like, again, this is a small block nitrous car, so we're using a progressive controller. Basic tricks, I guess, on that are you can't leave with very little. You can't leave at 10% nitrous. You have to leave with enough to actually hit the tire. But you have to bring it in over, I'll say that really where the trick is. Yeah, you want to bring it in as quick as you can to go as fast as you can. But generally, when you do that, the car wants to flip itself over backwards if it actually sticks. So, managing it so you're not doing a big dumb wheelie instead of just going fast is really where it's key. I mean, obviously, you've got timing and stuff that you do have to do with. We try to stay out of that. I mean, I don't call myself an engine tuner. I think if I were to be in control of timing, I'd probably burn some shit up. But it still plays part of it. So, I mean, you have to have an idea of what you're doing. With this, like I'll say on this car, we can help suggest modifying the nitrous ramp some. Sometimes you'll come in and kind of like you'll hump it over. So it'll come up quick and taper off. Other cars, usually heavier cars, you can't do that with. You have to actually, like we used to always call it the skateboard ramp on this, where you'd leave it, it'd be climbing at a straight angle, we'll say. It's not staying level. Yeah, it'll come out and say, let's just say you're at, like, you leave at 25%, and in a half a second you're at 50%, and then at 1 second you're at 80%. So it kind of gets gradually more and more and more. In some cases, that's just what you have to do. Like I said, heavier cars, that seems to work better. But the power management portion of it is huge. And again, when it comes to the racetrack, like you asked, I mean, this track does have, at the time, it had a pretty good bump. I'd say it was about 80 feet out in the right lane primarily. So, we would quite often we would actually, pull some power out at that point. If we didn't have all the power in, we would definitely, slow it down a little bit right there, just to give it a little bit of cushion to get through. Sometimes you have to try some dumb stuff.
Was that Frank's car?
Yeah.
One time we tried to plan to wheelie over the bump and have it land just after it, so it didn't upset the front, but that didn't work out too well.
Yeah. No, we've tried a lot of dumb stuff. It doesn't always work.
I like that wheelie over the bump, kind of like bunny hopping a mountain bike. So in this picture, you can also see that this is a fully braced 8.8 rear end. The color tells me that these are AFCO shocks, maybe with year valving or maybe with Mensker valving. How do you figure out what kind of valving to put in shocks on the back of a car?
I mean, right now, anymore, we have AFCO make shocks with specific valving in it that we want. It's not necessarily that we told them how to build it. We just told them, like, the kind of the speeds that we would like to see. So we run that for cars that pretty much go into like a 480 range, as far as, stock suspension cars doing that. From that point on, we'll pretty much always go with a Menser valve shock. But if you're kind of asking how that we figure out what you want in the shock is, I guess that's just trial and error is what it's been.
Power and weight. You know, if you tell us you're making 1,800 horse, we're going to talk in a Menser right away. But if you're around 1,000 horse range, these will be more than fine. But it depends what you want to do in the future.
I have a question, kind of switching gears. We have somebody asking about an IRS car on a radial. Are you still looking for separation on an IRS car?
Yeah, we just talked about that. We've been working on some of the CTSV stuff lately.
Yeah, that one's tricky. So it's a good question, actually. So on the IRS cars, it's pretty much near impossible to get it to separate. I've heard people say that they have done it. I've never actually seen it myself. Every IRS car I've ever looked at has always wanted to physically squat in the back. Power management, again, comes into play. It's much, much, much more labor intensive, I would say, to make the cars like that make a lot of power go down the track. they get finicky, but you can make it work compressing it that way. But you are going to be limited. I mean, it's not that you can't go fast with it. Like, what's Rodney's kid's name? Cameron.
Oh, Cameron. Yeah, with the Red
So RPM transmissions, they've got a red Corvette, like a C5 Corvette or something. That thing's IRS, and he's pretty competitive with it. But when you look at it, I mean, what's he run? It's ran Extreme Street, Ultra Street. They run.
Yeah, I think he's been 460.
So if he's been 460s, 470s, something like that. It's a 275 car. It's fast. It's fairly consistent. But if you look at his 60-foot times, they're not where they would be in a car with a live axle, because they do have to kind of nurse it through that area a little bit more so than anyone else would. And I don't know specifically what they do. It's just, that's just a quick car that comes to mind, because it's a little bit lighter weight car. Now then, like Todd had mentioned, we've been doing a lot of stuff with the CTSV Cadillacs, the Gen 2 ones. And those ones are a lot heavier of a car, and their advantage of the weight is you do get a little bit of extra traction out of it. So it helps, but it's been difficult for us to really get a good grasp on how that they work when they start making a lot of power. But a lot of that is that they're still running a lot of factory ECUs, so the power management isn't quite there to do what we needed to do in all cases.
And it's kind of new for us. So, I mean, we're trying to play with shock settings that are still on that, because they're trying to squat. So we're kind of, when people are having issues, we're playing with, tightening the compression some. So instead of the car squatting, it's forcing the shock into the ground, which is a tire into the ground, basically trying to make it grab a little harder. But it is kind of new for us. So we're not pros on that by any means.
Yeah, I have an IRS 240, and that's kind of what I found. The only thing I can do is make it squat. So the guy's also asking, what about on slicks? Because I've never been able to make my car work anywhere as near on a slick as well as it does on a radial. Do you have any thoughts on that?
You're talking on the 240, you're talking?
The 240 is still an IRS suspension car.
Well, so yeah, for Phil. Yeah, and I mean, that's where usually the IRS cars with slicks get into problems, because they're actually oversticking the tire. So an IRS is really, really gets upset with a little bit of tire shake. And the way that they work is if you don't have enough power, as far as the slick, the basic general rule is going to be, if you don't have enough power, you're going to wad the tire up. It's going to shake and flop all over and try to destroy anything it can. Going straight into tire spin could be a little different story. I mean, so that comes back to, knowing whether it is spinning or if it's shaking into a spin. So that's another thing that a video really could tell you what's happening on, because that is going to be two different scenarios as far as a slick goes. And that could care less whether or not it's an IRS car or not. But
I guess my last question when it comes to this, so when you're going to a slick, since it does do that, you like the idea of running more tire pressure in a slick because of that, or would you go the opposite way?
We used to be a big fan of trying to run more tire pressure, but anymore, it really seems, since we've started really watching the videos, for the most part, until you get too much tire pressure, it feels, or it seems, more air in a slick is going to be more bite. So until you get to a point of having so much air that it has no chance of sticking, it will just spin at that point. But more air is more bite. So in general, if it's going out there and wadding the tire up, if you don't change the tune-up, you can actually start taking air out of it to get it to gain a little bit of wheel speed without actually, sticking the tire and folding over itself and then hopping all over the place.
Used to be there was an old rule when the car left, you wanted to see 3 wrinkles. Do you still follow that prescription, or how do you feel about that when it comes to tire pressure?
On a slick or on a radial, are you talking?
On a slick, yeah.
We say 3 wrinkles.
3 wrinkles. I mean,
I've heard different terms.
Yeah, I've heard that. I've heard well, there's 3 wrinkles. I've heard, you want to get, 1.5 revolutions of the tire. I'm not sure how someone can control that well. I mean, that seems like bracket racing stuff, where they're sticking the tire and going sort of thing. The wrinkles on the sidewall wrinkles definitely have a play in it. I mean, I would say I can't say 3 wrinkles is going to be it, because it's going to depend a lot on the tire. I would say maybe if you're on a 26 or a 28, you can probably do that. When you go up to a 31 or a 33, 3 wrinkles it's hard to even say it because those things just fold over themselves so bad. You have to have so little air in them to actually get them to pick up some wheel speed that they really, I wouldn't call it a wrinkle as much as, a fold in the sidewall at that point. So it's really hard to say, but if you're going to try to generalize it and say most people are running a 28-inch tire, I would buy into 3 wrinkles would probably be in halfway decent shape, that it's not overly wadded up to where it's folding over, but yet it's, if you only had 1 wrinkle, it's picking up too much wheel speed, because that's really what you're trying to fight with. That is, have enough wheel speed to keep the car moving, but not so much that it's spinning, and not so little that it's just trying to shake it.
Mike, going back over to the radial talk real fast. There's a question on Facebook. A guy said, do you have a guideline or a basic of what you want to see in rear shock data?
It's really hard to say shock data over this without showing a picture, but basically the way that if you're doing we're talking stock suspension car again, something that's separating. I don't care if it's stock suspension or a 4-link, but if it's separating to go down the racetrack, what you will see, and I can point out a spot that people are going to always have problems, but your initial hit to the tire is going to move it. Say some cars we see 150,000, some cars we see 350,000. But you're going to see an initial spike in the shock, and then it's going to flatline for about 60 thousandths or so, and then continue its way up as far as the extension goes. So you'll always see, it'll extend a little bit, it'll flatline, then it'll continue separating to whatever its maximum separation is going to be. It's going to curl over at the top. That's the general, hopefully it'll curl over at the top. If not, you topped out your shock and you're in other problems. But the little flat line that you'll see, which is probably from about maybe a tenth and a half to 2 tenths into the run, there's a flat line. And most stock suspension cars, you will see that flat line actually still ever so slightly increase. That's good. So you always want to see the shock on an extension area. So always, we'll say the line's always on upward motion. If on that little flat line you're seeing a dip, then that is where you need to focus your attention on either power management or changing some bar angles. Maybe even, tire pressure could do it, because it could just be that it's sticking the tire and falling off because you don't have enough power. So you can fix it with power, but you could just adjust some tire pressure issues to make sure that it's not trying to wad the tire up and kill it right there.
That's usually where the converter's grabbing. If you don't have enough power right there, it'll actually dip it and you'll spin the tire.
When it comes to rear shock data and the position and how it's extending, do you guys look at the rate at which it moves as well as the position it moves to and from?
At that rate of speed.
Yeah, so you can look at the speed. I mean, there's shock speed does tell you a lot. I'm not overly concerned with that. I like to look at it just because I like looking at the lines, but really, as long as it's on a general path of where it needs to go, it's usually pretty good. Now, where the shock speed is really going to come into play, like where we really will start looking at it, is if we're having a problem. If the shock is extending and it's spinning the tire at some point where we know, this graph looks like every other graph that we look at, but yet this thing's spinning for some reason, and it happens to be at 30 feet out. We'll look at that and we'll try to see what it's doing, because a lot of times, when it spins, you're going to see the shock just extend a whole bunch because the tire grows, it throws the back of the car up in the air. That doesn't mean anything because obviously you're looking at the drive shaft shows that it's spun. But if you go into the shock speed, you can usually see a little ahead of the spin, whether it quickly tried to extend a little more or quickly tried to compress a little bit. And it'll give you a little better idea of, whether or not the tire was having a problem on the racetrack or if you were having too much power in it. So, if you try to put a little more power to it, you're going to see a lot of things on the data. But as far as shock speed goes, you'll see the shock speed kind of take off for a very brief moment. But usually, if you got a little too much power, you can see it in the accelerometer. You're going to see the G meters kind of spike and then the tire spin.
So to this issue on tire pressure, when people are setting up a new car as opposed to diagnosing what's happening with something already existing, and we're switching over here to one of the front suspension videos right now, by the way. So I'll just mention that's what's starting to show up on YouTube and Facebook. Is there a, like for a 275 guy running a 275 Pro or a 315, is there a starting point that you like to see people use for tire pressure, just so that you can begin to baseline what the car is doing and have a sense of where some standard settings are?
I mean, there's always a starting point, but there's not just one number. A 2,700 pound car with a 148 first gear is going to be a different starting point than a 3,400 pound car with a 248 first gear. It's going to be different. So there's not one number for all.
Understood.
Something on this video that, if you guys are watching, that's been corrected on this car is the you notice the amount of spacer they have between the steering arm and the tie rod end, and that's bump steer correction. And that's something that gets overlooked an awful lot on drag race cars, but it's actually quite important. You guys want to touch on that?
Yeah, we can. That's since that's a video that's going here, it's a little off from rear tire pressure, but if you're watching this, bump steer is definitely a huge concern. Lots of people really try real hard to try to get zero bump steer through full travel. You can do that on certain cars. This video is taken on a G-body. That's GM's absolute worst built vehicle in history. It's hard, very difficult on a car like that to actually get rid of it, but you can minimize it. If you look at it, this thing, actually, this car has a rack in it that's not installed absolutely perfectly. So it's got a little bit more bump steer spacer out at the other end, but that will also increase because of caster. So this being a double A-arm car, as you increase the caster, you're taking that steering arm, raising it up. You do need to correct the tie rod pivot there. And we do have a little tech section on our website, and bump steer is actually one of the big things on there that a lot of people use. And they call us for it just on basic questions, but it makes it pretty simple. A lot of people, this is another one of those misconceptions, I guess. Back in the day, everyone was always told for bump steer to be correct, your tie rods need to be level. At ride height, make them level and you're good. Well, that's absolutely completely wrong. The tie rods need to be moving at about roughly the same angle as the lower control arms. So if you draw an imaginary line between the pivot of the lower A arm and the rough pivot of the ball joint, that line should roughly indicate where your tie rod angle should also be. But that's also assuming that you have, a correctly located rack, especially the correct width rack. Like this being a G-body car, it does need a lot narrower rack than a normal Pinto rack that a lot of people are used to using. Mustangs get away with a Pinto rack because it's basically the same geometry as a factory Mustang. But, when you go putting these things into, any of the GM cars that were equipped with a steering box and a center link and all that stuff, if you don't do that right, you're definitely going to be in trouble. And the bump steer will be completely different, and usually it'll be a very small window that you can get the bump steer good within if you have the wrong rack on it. But if you got the right one on, like this car does have the right one, just whoever put it in a little low because they were probably a little more worried about putting a big oil pan in or something like that than they should have been about making sure that the driver of the car wasn't going to crash. So
I did see one question, just so people know, bump steer is when the front end is going throughout travel, that's the tires towing in and out throughout travel. You want to minimize that. Most people have seen some kind of car out there do a little bit of a wheel stand, not a wheel stand, just, carry the tires. And when it lands, the front tires shake like crazy. You can see it in slow-mo. You don't even need it in slow-mo. You can see that all the time. That's bump steer. And that'll kill stuff. And especially what a lot of people overlook is downward bump steer. People are always worried about upward travel, ride height to upward travel, and that'll, and you need to. But the other thing is when you hit the brakes at the top end, go 150, 180, 200 mile an hour, it's going to nose over past ride height. And that is probably the most important part. You need to make sure you don't have any bump steer at that point. If the tires toe out right there, you're going to rip the steering arms off. You're going to rip the spindles. You're going to break the brakes. You'll rip the tie rods out of the rack. There's, everything will happen, and going that kind of speed, that's probably the most critical spot to worry about, and people overlook that. So you need to drop the car down below ride height and make sure it never toes out. If it does, then you're in trouble.
Yeah, that's like like what Todd said there, the towing out part is really, if you have a car that you're trying to adjust bump steer and you have no other choice because all the parts out there are what you have to work with. Always, always, always make sure it does not tow out anywhere throughout its travel. You can pigeon toe that thing like crazy, and it can have 5/8 of an inch of toe in on each wheel, and it'll scrub some speed. It's not very good for anything, but it's not going to put you in a dangerous situation. It's not ideal, but toe out is going to be the worst thing that you can do, because when the tires start towing out, if they both tow out the same, they're going to fight each other and pull the car from side to side. That's where you're going to get that big wiggle. If they both tow in, it's just going to scrub some speed. It's not the end of the world. But that's the biggest thing, that if you can't make it right, just make sure it never ever tows out, and you'll be in okay shape until you can correct whatever problem you have going on.
Yep, and make sure you take the springs out when you're doing that and drop it down below ride height to simulate shutdown area.
Yeah. So
going
for
back
guys
to
that
rear
are,
suspension,
go ahead, Mark.
Going back to rear suspension, we had a question on Mixler. On a standard 8.8 rear end with no adjustment for the lower control arm or upper control arm besides length, and you're stuck at or around 95 to 100% anti-squat, do you still want to adjust the rear shocks to separate, or will it not separate since you are at a mechanical disadvantage on a radial car?
Let me do this.
I mean, on a radial, yeah. I mean, you're not really controlling the separate. I mean, you're controlling the separation with the shock, but if you're that close to 100, you need to run, depending on power level, you need to run that rear shock, that rear rebound pretty loose and the compression super tight to make sure any little bit of separation is getting holds that tire into the ground.
Right. I mean, that's kind of a loaded question. I'm going to guess that the guy asking that actually has a little bit of an idea what he's talking about. 100% anti-squat, for people that don't know what that is. Anti-squat is a made-up mathematical term for how much the rear end should move. So 100% means that pretty much no matter what, unless you hit a bump, that thing should not move up or down. That doesn't generally happen on a racetrack because there's a lot of other forces that come into play besides just that numerical instant center, imaginary point out there. That's why I kind of say it's a little bit of a loaded question, because I have yet ever to see a car at the racetrack that does not either squat or separate. It's usually going to do one or the other. Mustangs, if it's an 8.8 and it's stock location, everything, frame mounts, all of that, the only way you're going to get that thing to not separate is to have that thing on a 26-inch tire that's tucked 2 inches up into the fender, and that lower control arm is pointed downhill like 5 degrees. If you can screw your car up bad enough to do that, then you have the means to put the right equipment on there to make it actually do what it needs to do to go down the track. So, but like Todd said, if the thing truly is at about 100%, if you were to measure it out and that actually worked out and somehow you came up with that number in reality, you will have to run the extension quite a bit looser than most people. I mean, that's a general rule with most of the drag radial racing. I'd say up until you get to around the 1,000 horse ranges, you pretty much will run the extension or the rebound pretty loose, and you're going to run the compression pretty tight. What that will allow it to do is, take any bit of momentum it can to push the rear end down and the body up. That's going to be the extension side. So you want that loose so it can do that and do it efficiently. But then you need the compression pretty tight so that when it does separate, however little bit it may, that it tries to hold it there for a longer amount of time to keep the tires loaded as you apply the power as you get moving. So if you can make it through 20 or 30 feet where you're relying on the compression of the shock, that will usually get you through the rest of the run.
I sincerely apologize for bouncing around on you, because we had a question come in. A guy wants to know what bump steer is.
I think that's when I saw that question. I talked about that a little bit ago.
Oh,
but
okay.
Bump steer is towing in and towing out of the tire through travel. Get that shake.
Yep.
So
Mark, so Todd, if you expand on that a little bit. So admittedly, we're seeing the one video here showing this particular front suspension on the G body, For a guy who's got a car, maybe doesn't even have an alignment rack, you were talking about some things that they need to do to test for making sure that they don't get tow out anywhere in the travel. What's the procedure you'd like to see people do?
If you don't have that, you can do it with the string, where you tie that string around the back tires and going forward, right, just where they barely touch the front tire, with the string all the way around the car, and some jack stands or whatever. And you can do that, but you kind of have to take the springs out or have some heavy people sit on the front of the car to simulate it nose and over. But you got to, go through full travel, take the travel limiters off if it has it, go through full travel or whatever normal extension you would run, I guess. And just make sure it doesn't tow out, and you can adjust the tie rod angle up or down, whichever way it needs to go. And that'll change how much tows in and tows out throughout travel. I guess
you can also take a flat bar and mount it to the tire so that you get a little bit of extension out in front and behind that front tire, and take a tape measure from both sides. And then you can put it at the low point, put it at the midpoint, put it at the high point, and measure in front and behind the tire, and you'll see the toe in, toe out, because the bars will exaggerate it a little bit. You can find that minimized point by adjusting as you go to figure out where it's minimized between all the travel.
Right. Yeah. That would work too.
Yeah.
Just got to take into account the camber change too.
Yeah. Essentially what you're trying to do is find the best angle of the tie rod versus what turns out to be the working angles of the suspension. So like this car that we're looking at, again, it's a double A-arm car. It is, the spindle's going to go up and down at the same point, same motion every time. Because there is some camber change, that's going to be the top of the tire tipping in or out a little bit as it goes through travel. When you're doing that, the steering arm is going to move in or out a little bit. So what you're trying to do is take that arc that the steering arm is going through. If you were to physically lift the wheel up and down perfectly straight, you're trying to figure out at what point does the tie rod end have to be to try to track within that same arc that the steering arm would be moving in a perfect world. Again, you can usually, in most of these cars, you can get them really good for about 4 or 5 inches of total travel. That in the compression side or the extension side, because you have everything to work with as far as how far the shock is going to move. And like a car like this, say it's got a 4-inch shock in it, it's going to move roughly 8 inches total. So fully compressed to fully extended on the shock. And if you can get the bump steer really good within 4 to 5 inches of that total travel, you're good. So at the extreme end of travel, so high side, what most people are a lot of people look for is a lot of travel off the starting line. If you have a little bit of toe in at the very top end of that, take that over having it on the compression side, like Todd was saying. So you want to make sure, really, really make sure that when you lift at the top end, when you're going the fastest you're ever going to go on that racetrack, that when it does nose over and come down, that you don't have a toe in issue there. So we usually say, or toe out, that you don't have a toe problem there, because, if I'd say you want to check it and be really good within at least 1.5 inches of compression. And then, whatever in the extension that you get. And a lot of people will question that, like, oh, well, you always see them towing in, going down the racetrack. But usually, the front end settles. Most people know it. Most of the cars will do it. You leave the line, the front end comes up. When the wheels touch back down, it tends to settle a little bit as you pick up some speed. Where the bump steer will be a problem on the high end of travel is going to be at the slower mile per hour that you're doing. So it'll affect things, and it's still not great, and there's always ways to remedy it. But again, if you're stuck with what you have right now and you realize you're at the racetrack, like, holy crap, I've got a problem, and you've got means of actually setting the toe up there, like a friend's got some toe plates or something, you just make sure that it's at least good through some of the compression and as much of the extension travel as you can get, and you'll be in good enough shape until you have to fix something. And a lot of times you can get stuff really good. If it's got 8 inches total travel, you can get really good for 7.5 inches of it. And that last 1/2 inch, be it on the top or the bottom, might give you a bit of a hard time, but that's not all too bad.
Yeah, so for guys that are looking at this video, you're seeing a number of things. You're seeing an aftermarket spindle with a bolt-on steering arm. You're seeing an adjustable sleeve type tie rod end. You're seeing an extender on the bolt that goes down through the steering arm into the rod end on the tie rod. So there's a lot of bits and pieces here that are involved in that. And everybody be sure to pick up on what they just mentioned about the angle of the tie rod itself relative to the angle of the lower control arm, and having those move in parallel to avoid big changes in bump steer. So there's a whole lot of elements to that. Other things in this, we can obviously see a fabricated lower control arm. How should people think about that when they're selecting parts like this, shock length and other things in order to get the front suspension working right, whether it's a G body or a Fox body or some other platform?
You mean like what should they think about as far as what parts to choose?
Yeah, I mean, given, let's say this is a guy with a, single turbo LS swapped G body, Fox body, and I realize these platforms are different, but what do they need to be looking at in terms of what they're going to do with front suspension? We can start with front, then come back to rear. But
all right, so on like a double arm car, like a G body Camaro.
Yeah.
Well, first gen or second gen Camaro. I mean, for one, you got to know what you're doing with the car. If it's going to be like street strip, drag, you know what I mean? Because there is variances from all drag stuff to street stuff. You don't want to run super lightweight chromoly stuff on the street, really. That's one thing. Power level. Not everybody wants or needs a coilover. I mean, if you're making 500, 600 horse and you need 4.5 inches of upward travel, which that's what they need. I mean, that's fine, but a coilover doesn't really have the stored energy that a stock style spring has. You know what I mean? So, we generally don't really recommend a coilover for some of them cars if you're running under 800-900 horse, something like that, just because you kind of need that stored energy to help shoot the front end of the car up to get the weight to the back tires.
So you're saying
that touches on one of the customer questions or listener questions, only talking about rear springs. He said, on a rear coilover spring, is the rule of thumb for the lightest spring to hold the car up? Is that a good rule to follow?
I saw that. I mean, it kind of depends on the tire. For a radial, yes, that is a rule. Or that's what we go by. For a slick, we try to run a little bit heavier spring just to not band-aid, but to make sure you're not hitting the tire super hard, because a lighter spring is going to make it hit the tire hard. That's what a radial likes, and you have a shock to control that. A slick doesn't really like to be hit that hard, so we run a little bit heavier spring so it doesn't separate and hit the tire that hard. So it kind of depends on the tire. But for radial, yes, that would be correct.
So let's go ahead, Mark.
I was just going to go through some questions here that I'm getting behind on. But on a car with a split monoleafs at Caltrax, would you set compression tight and rebound loose also?
Not always. I mean, because a Caltrax deal is going to hit the tire very hard already. That's why usually, if you're making good power and you have a Caltrax or a leaf spring car, you need a really good shock to control it, or else that thing is just going to slam the tire in the ground. And there is, even with a radial, there is such a thing as hitting it too hard. So something like that, they tend to actually run the rebound a little bit tighter than what, a 4-lane car or something like that would run, just so it doesn't separate too hard and slam the tire in the ground.
Yeah, and it all depends on power level again. I mean, if you're talking a guy that's got a split monoleafs and Caltrax and he runs 950s, he can definitely run it looser on the extension tire on the compression. It's just those cars, leaf spring cars, are so inherently aggressive that they will start ramping up the valving on them a lot quicker than most of the other stock suspension cars will, just to keep the tire under control. Because the worst thing that you can really do when you start talking about separating these things is you have enough power to hit the tire hard and get the car moving. But what happens is if you keep on running the shock too loose, you will top out the shock as you get moving down track. And we've seen cars top out the shock in 0.8 of a second, but then we've also seen some cars top it out in 2 seconds. And the power levels could be exactly the same, but it could just be dependent upon the way that the car is physically set up. Again, like I said, the leaf spring cars they're very aggressive. They do want to separate really hard, really fast. So they do need a good shock. I mean, and, you know, when it just depends on power level. If you start talking, you're making 1,000 horse or more, you better have at a minimum a good set of AFCOs on there. Most of the people will have the Mensers or like a Santa type shock.
Yeah.
Something that has a very aggressive rebound valving in it to keep it under control, because it's still going to separate quick, but the more power you throw at it, the faster it wants to do it. And there's no real rule of thumb that say you want this thing to only move so fast, so quickly. But your car, if you progress from 500 horsepower to 1,500 horsepower, if you were to watch it, if it does good hitting the tire at 500 horsepower, you pretty much want to make it look visually about the same. But if you throw 1,500 horse at it where 500 horse was, you're going to see it just throw the back of the car in the air, top out the shock. It will sometimes even pull the rear end up off the ground and spin the tires that way. So then you're definitely separating too quickly. So you will have to start tightening the valving as you go, and that's a big easy thing. More power, it will be tighter, but in reality, it's still relatively loose compared to like a big tire 4-link car with slick, like a 33-inch slick. They run the extension, complete opposite direction, but they're just doing things totally different than what we're talking about right now.
So the other things that people do on leaf spring cars, and having been a leaf spring guy for a long time, I'm one of those, you switch with a Caltrac where you've got an aluminum front bushing instead of a rubber front bushing. So now everything moves a little easier. You've got a slider in the back, so everything moves a little bit easier. So in other words, everything is done to allow the spring to hold up the car. And I apologize for my Rottweilers in the background here. Okay, I'm going to have to stop. Anyway, when people start reducing stiction in suspension, they need to think about more shock control. Is that generally correct?
Yeah, I mean, it's for sure. I mean, it's all about tire wrinkle, really. I mean, it's, you want regardless you're making 500 horse or 1,500 horse, you want the tire wrinkle not to be too much on a radial and a slick, I guess. But, you don't want it to overhit the tire and fold over if you're on a radial. So it's all about that. I mean, you're getting rid of the rubber bushing and, just to get rid of inconsistencies. That's why you want the aluminum. You want stuff solid. You want the rear suspension to move consistently and then just control it with the shock.
What about ride height level? Kevin Eisenbach asks, he's seen some cars slightly lower on the left side. He assumes it's to prevent from hitting the right side so hard.
Usually when you see cars that are going to be sitting a little low on the left side, that's a lot of leaf spring cars will do that. A lot of ladder bar cars will do that. Normally that is a car that does not have an anti-roll bar in it. So when you start adjusting it, so like all these cars counteract, we'll say this, the drive shaft, if you're looking from the front of the car, is obviously turning the same direction as the crank, so it's going clockwise. Well, when that all gets back to the back of the car, gets the rear end and everything starts moving, that's what wants to roll the car over to the passenger side. So from the back of the car, you see the thing, pitch way up. Like a Caltrac bar or a slide link, something like that. You can load that. The same thing with a ladder bar. You will load the driver's side bar or link, whichever way you want to call it. And what that will do is it'll actually drive the driver's side of the car down a little bit. It's doing more than just adjusting the ride height that way. I mean, the ride height is kind of lowering because of the load that you're putting into the rear suspension. And they're doing that to try to counteract that rollover, because otherwise what happens is it's going to be taking some weight off the right side tire, and the car will steer a little towards the right because it's got a little less traction on the left side. So by doing that, it will drive it down. A lot of the cars will sit a quarter. I've seen a half an inch lower, but usually that's because you're running a car without a anti-roll bar, which is another misconception, I guess, that I didn't even think of, is many people think ladder bars and leaf springs do not need anti-roll bars because they are using the rear end as an anti-roll bar, which is, again, entirely wrong. But those are the cars that you're going to see that have the lower driver's side. I mean, aside from the fact that most people don't race for the passenger in the car, and most drivers are not generally lightweights out there, so the driver's side of the car is going to sit a little bit lower in most cases if you don't get under there and try to adjust for it.
Yeah, I mean, if you have not a ladder bar, not a leaf spring car he's talking about, but something, like a G body or something, you can, if you have coilovers all the way around, you can disconnect the anti-roll and level that car out with the driver in the car. You got to make sure the driver's in the car. You level it out and then hook up the anti-roll, do your thing. If you have one. If you don't, you'll be twisted up.
If you don't, you'll be calling us trying to figure out how the heck to get your car to go straight.
We've got a guy on Mixler that's wondering, on a torque arm car like a third gen Camaro, 275 radial, how does torque arm mount height and torque arm length affect anti-squat?
Well, again, I could put it this way. Anti-squat is a made-up number also. So your anti-squat percentage it's a thing that's there, but unless you really, 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 really have done the work to learn what your center of gravity height is, it's an irrelevant number. So, you don't have to really look at, like, if you're trying, which a torque arm is hard to plot out what its instant center is going to be anyway. So without knowing that, you really don't know what its anti-squat is. But what I think he's more so asking, and the way I'm going to answer the question is basically if it's separating or if it's squatting. Torque arm cars are one of the stock suspension cars that is very easy to make it squat, maybe a little more difficult to make it separate. So as far as like drag radials go, they are a totally different breed out there. A big thing on them is the shorter it is. So I'll generalize it here. As far as the torque arm goes, the shorter it is and the higher it is attached to the frame, the more it will want to separate, and or the faster and more it's going to want to separate. Conversely, if you make it longer and you mount it lower, it will absolutely make the car squat. A lot of people ran a lot of torque arms on these cars for a while before the drag radial stuff got big. People would run really long torque arms because they made the car less violent. And what they would do is they'd start mounting them, next to the transmission. We're talking like at the back of the trans case where the tail shaft housing is attached at, kind of in the stock location, maybe a little more forward of that. And when you start to lower the car on top of that, so you're changing your lower control arm angle, you're making those point downhill a little bit if you haven't messed with anything. So if you have your lower control arms pointing slightly downhill and a long torque arm, you are going to make that thing squat. And that's not necessarily a bad thing if you're running a slick. If you're running a radial, it's going to give you some headaches and make it a little tough for you. But like I said, if you're trying to adjust what you're calling your anti-squat as, if you have a high anti-squat, is going to be, a shorter, higher mounted torque arm
and a lower control arm angle running a pretty good amount uphill.
Yeah.
It needs to have a pretty good amount of angle going to the frame. And we've been pretty, on a radial, and we have 3 guys in a torque arm that have been, 4.0s, 14s,
200 plus,
390s, even Greg Powery. No, he went 402, didn't he?
He went 401.
But, for a fairly short torque arm, kind of high, a lot of lower angle, and a badass anti-roll bar. Since that torque arm's off center, it's really trying to twist that car up, and you really need a good anti-roll on them things to keep it straight. That's, a couple guys that put that Girth Brooks anti-roll we have on, that twin tube one. It's changed the car around the torque arm deal.
So I got to laugh.
Why do you call it the Girth Brooks anti-roll?
We got the shirts for that too.
Brooks, yeah. Girth Brooks.
It's
our guy Nick came up with that at the shop. Yeah,
it's an entire 2 1/4 inches of girth. Yeah, it's a big badass dude, and we basically, it's a little off topic, but we did develop that because of the fairly heavy, ridiculously high powered drag radial cars out there. Most of those cars have gotten down in weight, but for a few years there, even still, there's a few combinations that you will have to be 3350, but that thing will make 3,500 horsepower. So, we had a lot of cars that needed that, and the torque arm cars were actually the ones that really did it. Like, Jody Boyles. I'm not sure, who's watching here that knows who Jody Boyles is. He's got a white 3rd gen. Currently, his new car, I think he was running in like Pro 275, but he generally would run.
He went to the semis in LDR with his old car. With Brooks in it.
Yep, that's it. So he's got it's a torque arm car. It's one of the quickest torque arm cars out there at the moment.
411. It's been a 411.
Yeah. It's a pretty serious piece, but that car was one of the ones that made me up the anti-roll bar game again because he needed it. Because the torque arm, like Todd said, being offset, it does, with more power, it induces a lot of body roll. And to counteract that, you need an anti-roll bar that really, really, really can, keep that thing in place. Which
one of the things that you wanted to talk about before the show was bar angle instead of instant center. And because we've been talking about instant center and anti-squat and this and that, maybe you want to touch on where you're going with when we get into a 4-link car, bar angles instead of instant center, because Justin Shear talked about that too.
Well, yeah, I mean, we talk bar angles with everyone more so. And the biggest reason is the majority of the cars that we help on, that we're hands-on with, we don't have them at our shop. Like at our shop, we try to focus on making parts. We're on the phone a lot, doing, answering all these questions that we're talking about right now. We don't work on the cars. That doesn't help our lives all too much. But what happens is we show up at the racetrack and the car's already built. The car's already bolted together. It's ready to race. And we have, a platform sitting in front of us that we have to try to figure out how to make it work. So, what we do, and it's a generalization, but we don't measure it, because if you measure a stock suspension car is very, very, very difficult. I don't want to say impossible, because it can be done, but it's very difficult to actually measure what if you want to call the 4-link, what is 4-link instant center is. So for some of the people that don't know, what the instant center is an imaginary point out in space that is where the rear suspension is trying to pick up the car at. So if you were to draw a line between the upper control arms and the lower control arms looking from the side, where those 2 points meet is what is called the instant center. If you're an engineer out there, it's technically called the moment of inertia. That is the spot in the vehicle that, with the car sitting statically, that if you were to try to pitch the rear end, it's going to try to pick the car up at that specific point. Again, the reason we don't measure it is because it's almost impossible to. The upper control arm, for the most part, is, in most of these cars, take a GMA body, a G body, or a Mustang. All three of them have factory triangulated 4-links. All three of them, their upper control arm bolt, or we'll say, if you have spherical bearing or whatever, the pivot up there is directly above the axle tube. It might be a little forward of the center, a little behind the center, but when you're trying to measure to the ground, there is an axle tube that's in your way, and you cannot get a perfect measurement of it. You can guesstimate your height. You can get kind of close, and it will be kind of close. But the reality is, if you're off 1/8 of an inch on some of these measurements, your instant center length could be off by upwards of 6 or 10 inches. And I mean, that's not an exaggeration. Like if you measure the length of the control arm incorrectly by 1/4 of an inch, it will in most cases make a 10-inch swing in where everything is. So we don't go up that.
So you're saying garbage in, garbage out when it comes to that kind of stuff?
Pretty much. I mean, it's not that. I mean, what happens is people read on the internet, like, I've got a drag rail car, I make 1,500 horsepower, I need my instant center to be 38 inches out and 8 inches high. Well, that's great. If you can make sure that it's actually there, you might be kind of close. But again, if you measure 1/4 inch wrong and you think you're at 38 inches, but you're at 28 inches, guess what? You're going to hit the tire super hard. You're probably going to top the shock out. You're going to have all sorts of weird issues because it's going to be ridiculously aggressive, and you won't understand why, because you think that you set it up just like the guy, on whatever message board that you were reading that said he set it there. So that's why we go off of bar angles. Anyone with a protractor can pretty much read what the angle of the control arms are at. So we go off of that. We use that because it's something that we can crawl under the car and actually measure and be like, yep, this is at 12 degrees down on the upper, and this lower control arm is at 4 degrees going up. And we'll look at that and go, well, that's right in the middle of where we would always try to run it. Let's try to make an easy pass, and let's see what happens, because it may not be right on that car, and those numbers, they all
or
change.
that track.
Yeah, or the
the
track.
other thing. There is no set. People are always looking for a set number. No prep's huge these days. There's good tracks, there's bad tracks with no prep. Stuff like that. Not every car needs the same power level, gearing,
Weight is huge.
Front rear weight bias, the tire you're on. We'll change the lower bar angle for a bad track versus a good track. On the same car, just
right. 2 weeks.
We don't run the same angle on every single car. It's just it kind of varies based on, again, what the tire looks like and what the tire needs.
Can you talk a little bit more about the no prep? What would you do differently for a no prep car?
I didn't really mention that. We haven't done a lot of no prep. We get a lot of questions on that. We don't, to be honest, have a lot of experience with the no prep stuff. We have our ideas of what might need to happen, but we haven't actually been hands-on with the no prep car.
We don't run radials.
No,
yeah, that would be a thing.
That's the best advice you can give anyone. Is if it's a true no prep, a radial is a no win. That's for sure.
Just we get that call a lot. We haven't been hands-on with a no prep car. I don't know, it's even going away, at least out by us. But I mean,
yeah, in our opinion, no prep racing is not very fun because most of it, they don't give you time slips. So I kind of see it as a cop out for the drag strips around there to not have to do any work besides provide a facility. And I don't really feel that that's the way that this, I guess hobby or whatever you want to call it should be run.
Yeah. I mean, I'd assume a no prep car needs a little bit more aggressive bar angle than what a prep slick car would need, but
it'll come back.
I don't have any real input on that, to be honest.
You real tuner guys are going to be the ones that are going to be the ones that go down the track, because power management is going to be way more of a necessity than anything else besides having a tire. As long as you have 4 tires on the car, you need someone that can power manage the car, and then you can probably do halfway decent.
With weight distribution and the right tire, as someone who very briefly, no prep with a car that was set up for radials, that was just not worth bothering with. We've had oh, good, bro. Oh, what, you saw the video? Anyway, there's been a couple of other questions that have gone by, going back to more of the topic. So one of the things that showed up in the first video was the braced housing and the location where you could see the coilovers are straight up and down. Are there some basic things about setting up the geometry, and are there levels, and I know I'm asking multiple questions at once here, but are there levels at which what people need to be thinking about with setting up a rear housing, whether it's an 8/8 or a 12 bolt or a 9-inch or what have you, rules of thumb for what you need to be thinking about for how quick the car goes and weight and power?
You can do this.
A weight and power as far as
weight and power, I think kind of throws it off a little bit. I mean,
you mean as far as if you're going to choose an 8.8 over something?
No, I think it just means if you're building a rear end, this is what I'm taking this to be. If you're building a rear end for a race car and you don't have the car built entirely yet, shock.
Yeah, how do you decide? What do you need, and where do the shocks need to be? And,
I gotcha. I mean, generally the wider the better. Yeah. I mean, you don't want to be hitting something, but it'll have the anti-roll and the shocks are going to have more control. You don't want to be 12-inch on center when you could be 20-inch on center or 25. As long as you're not hitting anything or whatever. Right. The wider the better. To a point. You don't want a 50-inch long anti-roll. That's probably gonna that's probably gonna twist.
It'll probably pop your tires. So no, if you're doing it that way, a longer shock is always a better shock in the back. No matter what, you can never have a shock that's too long. I mean, we always tell people a 5-inch stroke shock is going to be the absolute bare minimum that you can get by with for the most part. Once you start making more power,
leaf spring, you need more. At least a 6.
Yeah, that's a good point. Leaf spring cars always are going to be more because they do move a lot more. But if you mentioned 8/8 and 12 volt and stuff like that, so I'm thinking A bodies, G bodies, Mustangs. A 5-inch stroke minimum. Most people will go with a 7 if you can fit it. Most of those vehicles, you are going to have to mount the top of the shock inside the trunk if it's a 7-inch stroke. Or you're just going to have a really low bracket on the housing, which is perfectly okay if you're okay with how it looks. But 5 to 7 is always where you want that. Like Todd said, wider for the shock is always better. As vertical as possible is going to be a big thing. If they're on an angle, so let's say a G body car,
to stock location.
Yeah. Stock location G body car. You can do a coilover in stock location, and it's not that it's a bad thing, but stock location on them, the shocks are on like a 15-degree angle. So as you add angle, you're losing actual like shock rating, I guess you want to say. So like the stiffness of the shock goes away because 2 inches of rear end movement maybe only equates to 1.5 inches of shock travel. So the shock is essentially weaker, and you can combat that with a little bit heavier rate spring. So like a stock location G body, stock location A body, those cars you can still do a stock location coilover shock and just make the variance that you need with the spring. But like Todd said, the wider the better. A big thing that I tell people though, if you're redoing the back of the car, if you're putting a coilover in the car and you're doing an anti-roll bar, which I would hope that most people are doing these days, if you can mount the anti-roll bar and the shocks on the same cross member, it makes, for one, your life a lot easier. It makes the car a little bit lighter because you're not adding extra stuff to it. But the shocks and the anti-roll bar work together. So if they're both mounted on the same tube, that they're both working off the same point. So it just makes the whole rear suspension a little more efficient as far as that goes. Other things, that Bill's asking on rear ends. We get a lot of people when we're doing housings that go, okay, well, we'll take a Mustang. I've got a 7-inch backspace wheel, and I need you to make, we need to move the lower control arm brackets. We need to do this and that. Well, you come to find out that they don't actually have that wheel. They have a 5-inch backspace, 10-inch wheel, and they want to go to a 12-inch wheel. So they think they have to go to a 7-inch backspace. So if you don't have the wheels yet, one thing I would say is I would always urge people to get a 3 or a 4-inch backspace wheel if you need to buy wheels, and then build the rear end around it, because the wheel costs you the same amount of money and it weighs the same. But if you can take 3 or 4 inches off of each side of the rear end housing and the axle, you're making the housing shorter, which makes it stronger and it makes it lighter. You're making the axles shorter, which also makes them stronger and lighter. So if you had to buy everything, like say, we're building a 9-inch for someone, you can spend the same amount of money and take an additional 15 pounds out of the car just by changing up your thought process and going with a little bit lesser backspace wheel. So that's a big thing when it comes to, doing any of the rear end housings. It doesn't matter what kind of housing it is, but if you're buying all the parts, try to, spend the same amount of money and, make it go as far as you can.
Yeah. Also, if you have a beadlock, it's kind of hard to get the tires on there with a 6 or 7-inch backspace wheel with the bell. It's a lot easier with a 3 or 4.
Yeah, as someone who has done that, yes, it's true.
Yeah, some people don't think about
that.
That
wasn't directed at you, Bill.
Yeah, no, that's fair. This is also from someone who is a very happy TRZ customer. So I want to get out my bias here at this point in the conversation. Along those lines, is there a benefit or a disadvantage, or how do you guys weigh in on whether an anti-roll bar should be mounted up above in the chassis or underneath on the housing?
That's something that's, for one, if you're running like tailpipes, street kind of car or whatever, it's kind of hard to mount one unless you're going to mount it like to the cage and drop links through the floor. But it kind of takes up too much room because of the tailpipes. It's easier to mount it underneath.
That's really about the only
I'd say I'm more of a fan of the ones mounted to the chassis because I feel like you can stiffen up where it's mounted to. You can tie the cage in the cross member. You can have that cross member hold the shocks. You can have all kinds of mounting points right there and have it real stiff. I don't really would like mounting an anti-roll to, a housing that's going to twist or flex, I guess. If you have it like a non-braced 8.8 or something like that, those axle tubes are moving, they're going to flex, and when you're doing that, to me, it's going to lock up the anti-roll a little bit throughout travel. Maybe, I don't know exactly what it'll do. I haven't seen shock data, but my assumption is it wouldn't be great. But I just prefer the chassis ones. I feel like they're a lot more stiff.
On the chassis side, an old debate, which is still valid, is sprung weight versus unsprung weight. So especially, again, drag radial type stuff where you're tossing the back of the car up. what goes up must come down. I'm sure there's a name for that law. I can't think of it offhand. Yeah, Newton's law. There you go. So
that's Newton's second, but okay, we'll keep going.
If you've got weight on the body, you can use it to your advantage. So chassis weight in the back of the car is used to your advantage. So if you take an average aero bar, it's going to say all in all be 15, 20 pounds, something like that, and you mount that to the rear end, well, you have something that it may work just as efficiently, but you don't have the advantage of the weight that you are required to be carrying at that point. Because if you have one, you're either going to mount it up on top or underneath. So you've already got that weight. If you can use that weight to your advantage by mounting it on the chassis side, then that's going to be better, because then you have that much additional traction available if you use it correctly, kind of based off everything else we've been talking about. If it's underneath, it'll still work and do the job of being an anti-roll, but you're just then carrying the weight just for the fact of it not twisting over on you. But again, you put it up on top, you're not rolling the car over, but you have a little bit extra weight that has to be there anyway. You might as well use it to your advantage.
Yeah. So everyone who is watching the YouTube and the Facebook feeds is seeing pictures of some of these components. So hopefully everybody is kind of getting an idea of things you can do and how you could do it, and picked up on that idea of having the shocks as vertical as possible and as far out to the extremities as possible. There was a couple of other, questions that came by earlier, and I apologize. I'm trying to read and talk at the same time, which, as everyone knows, is not my strength. But people were talking about setting up their shocks, and you already spoke to length of the shocks and why longer is better. When they're specifying, what they want to buy, how do they know whether to get a single twin tube shock or a shock with an extra reservoir? How do you guys advise people on that kind of thing? Again, when they're looking at building a car, or they're going from a 500 horsepower naturally aspirated and suddenly they're going to make 1200 horsepower with a 4.8 and a LJMS cam and a turbo.
There's a couple of different ways to look at it. The biggest thing is going to be budget, really. There is really no situation when you're talking about like a canister shock. There's no situation where that will not help you, except for in the pocketbook. It's gonna cost not necessarily twice as much, but it's gonna cost you more. But the advantages to it. So a lot of people might not understand what a canister shock is, which is kind of what you're asking. So a normal shock is what you said, a twin tube shock. That's what everyone sees as a regular shock. So it's got a small piston inside, and it's got an oil reservoir outside of the piston. So basically the piston's inside a tube. There's another tube inside there. That's why it's called a twin tube. So the oil reservoir is just inside the outer tube that you would see. A canister shock is a huge benefit because it has a much larger piston, because it's a single tube shock. So you have more room inside, but a larger piston inside of it. And the oil reservoir is external. That's what the canister is. So that's a huge benefit on its own, because by making a larger piston inside, you have much more control over the up and down motion. Your other benefit is those are better at displacing any air that's in the system. Shocks are not a thing that we don't take them apart and do the stuff ourselves with them. I've learned a lot from the shock nerds over at Menser. Like a regular, most twin tube shocks, even factory, you can get a Bilstein shock or a Monroe Sensitrack. Those things have little bags. If you were to cut them apart, they have little bags of nitrogen in them, so that when they fill them with oil, that nitrogen, when you compress the shock, it compresses a little bit and it holds a little pressure against the oil. It is what it is. Strange uses them, I believe. I know that AFCOs have them in their twin tube shocks. And that's to try to help keep a little bit of the air out of the system. A canister shock has an advantage because you get to put nitrogen in the canister. So there's a separate little bag in there, I would say, that you can charge it. Yeah, it's a little bladder. So you can charge it with some nitrogen. that helps dissolve any air that's in the system. So the shock actually functions how it's supposed to. Like some people have taken shocks out of boxes. And I'm sure there's someone listening or one of you guys have done it where you can take it brand new and you can push it in and pull it out like a quarter inch or so. It'll kind of pop up and down a little bit. That's a little bit of air that's in the system. If you put nitrogen, like a true nitrogen charger on it, it'll dissolve the air that's in there and it gets rid of that. But the other benefit, especially on a rear shock, is you can now vary the amount of nitrogen that's in the shock. So if you've got a car that you really need to get that rear suspension up and moving because it's a low car. So if the car's center of gravity is really low, you need to be a lot more aggressive with everything. So, this is more talking like we'll say like the radial versus world style cars or, which are, LDR, anything that, 8th mile time, we're talking 430s faster, really, 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 really benefit from having a nitrogen charged shock, so a canister shock, to the point that they almost can't live without it because they can put 100 pounds of nitrogen in those canisters, and that actually helps kind of accelerate the shock up and plant the tire. But you go that far, you can take it back to cars that are running 5.0s or 520s. They would still benefit from the canister, but they don't need as much of a nitrogen charge in to help it do its job. It'll have much more control than a regular twin tube shock would.
So what this means for everybody is you're needing to go out to your local gas supplier and get a bottle of nitrogen. You'll need to buy a regulator so that you can regulate that kind of pressures into your shock valving. So if you're looking at whether you've got struts on the front or canister shocks or whatever on the back, so as you plan for all these things, it's one more thing you need to, put into the budget and be aware of that it's another part of the tuning process. And I think this is why there's so much love for the TRZ guys. So you guys were at SGMP for No Mercy this last weekend, and you guys on the local basis are supporting racers all the time. Is there like a top 3 thing that you get asked when you're out in the pits and supporting racers, are the things that everybody seems to need? And are the things that for a guy who's going to the track trying to figure this stuff out, you would say, get the handle on this or write down your measurements or know what these things are in order to be able to ask the best questions?
Yeah, sure.
I asked too many things.
The video with that
No, I mean, a video.
Yeah, we talked about earlier. Yeah.
Yeah, videos come up. I mean, having a video not from standing behind the car, from 40 feet away, that's a big thing. A video from the stands is better than standing behind the car, to be honest, but it still sucks. Get a good video. If you really have a question, bring us a good video, send us a good video that it just has to show the whole car from the side as wide an angle as you can get. Mainly because most people are having a hard time at the starting line. So that video definitely helps.
Mm-hmm.
Above and beyond that,
scaling numbers, it's
weight percentages. Front and rear.
Yes. I mean, the front and rear, you get some people have some wheel stand issues, and you talk back and forth for a while, and all of a sudden you find out, they're like 49% on the nose or something, something like that. So, I mean, having some scale numbers, not necessarily scale numbers, but front back ratio.
You can go to a truck scale and figure out what the front weighs, what the rear weighs, what the whole car weighs, and and that helps. I mean, it's not something that is, you don't have to have a set of race car scales to do it. You can figure out a way to do it. There's people out in the country that use their grain scales and do it, and it's probably not perfect, but it's better than just guessing.
So going back to that, it's a matter of like you pull on the truck scale and you've got half the car off the scale, half the car on. You do the weight, you pull to the other side, half on, half off, as a way to get a rough measurement. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. You take the front and you weigh the back, and then you add them together. That's your total.
And also usually tracks make you
with the truck scales, if you park the car in the right place, you get a split.
Well, yeah. I mean, some of those things are probably not the greatest. I mean, a Caterpillar scale might not be the best place to take your race car to. Most of the people go to the drag strip. I mean,
Yeah, if you're at the
there's usually
track,
scales.
they're scaling cars after a run and weighing them. They'll usually let you up.
And there's everyone knows there's ways of cheating those scales. If you're going to tell us numbers, this would probably go out more to anyone that's a grudge racer out there that might be listening. If we ask a question of you, tell us the truth. Don't say that your car weighs 3,000 pounds when in reality it weighs 2,250.
Or it makes 700 horse when you're making 2,300.
Yeah, there's that happens on a
Yeah, if you do that, any answer we tell you is going to be very incorrect.
So for grudge racers, these guys are your doctors. You know, they're confidential. Tell them the truth. You know,
Pretty
yeah.
much.
I eat a vegan diet every day. Yes, I do.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, talking about being at the track and doing that, what are the other things that people should do? I don't want to say take advantage of you guys, but and obviously you guys aren't all over the country, but you know, the Mickey Thompson guys are at events all over the country. There's all sorts of other things. What are the other things people need to be keeping track of and looking at in order to provide a diagnosis and give good information, whether it's to the tire guys, the suspension guys, the shock guys? What should people be keeping track of in their logs, you know, run to run?
Well, if people are, you know, it depends which log that you're talking. If you're just talking a normal run log, I mean, there's, you know, tire pressure is a big thing. Ride height is a big thing because, you know, springs will sag. That's one thing that a lot of people don't understand is they'll be like, oh, I just bought these springs from you like 4 years ago. Well, you know, if you ran this car once a month for 4 years, you probably have worn some springs out. Not all of them do, but if you run it hard, it will. So keeping track of your ride height does make a difference because if you haven't actually changed anything and your ride height's going down, your springs are sagging and that changes everything. But on a more technical side of things, if people have basic data loggers like a Race Pack Sportsman, we'll say that as a basic one, a lot can be learned off of, you know, engine RPM, drive shaft RPM, and a G meter. If you have those three things, you can really learn a lot of stuff, especially if you have a friend or you have a phone that you can give to your friend to take that video that we've talked about so many times already. You add those things up and you can really see where you're having a problem. And, you know, if you don't know how to correct it, if you have some of that information, any of it, you know, we can definitely help, you know, walk your way through it. Yeah, but that's like a lot of people will call up and they'll start talking and we can pretty much, you know, tell them how that their run went based off of the first couple of sentences that they say, because you can, not that we know what they did wrong already, but it's some of the things that happen are such a common scenario that we'd be like, okay, yeah, you went out there, it left, it knocked the tire off, you know, almost immediately, but not immediately. Yeah, you can figure that stuff out, but we know a lot of that because they've already told us, you know, like, well, I went out and the track wasn't great, and so I loosened it up and I did this, and that kind of gets back to what Todd said earlier about
loosening the front shock.
Yeah, you don't always want to loosen it up, so, you know, like, okay, well, yeah, the front end came up and knocked the tire off. Well, you know, you did it to yourself. There's that type of thing. But, you know, having some of that, like the G information is really, really, really big, but not everyone has that. So that's, again, having a video is like I'd say the number one thing is if you have a halfway decent video from the side of the car, you know, a lot of people can give you a lot of help if they can actually see what's happening versus trusting the driver, because the driver of the car generally does not know what actually happened to the car. They just know, they just know they spun. So if you just say what happened, it's hard and you can guess, but a video is number one. If you have nothing else, a video of the car is the best thing that you can have.
So other than the driver who says, I didn't lift, and the TPS log tells a different story, you mentioned G meters. What's the good way for people to get launch speed, acceleration data when we talk about G meter? What's the good way for people to get that kind of information?
I mean, most of the new EFIs have that built into it. If you're into EFI, I'm not sure if Holly has one built into it yet.
I think that somebody on here would know that.
Yeah, I think Scott might know that one a little bit better than me. I know they had one in a dash. Fuel Techs all have them. The Fast did not. Their new one that probably will. Haltech, I believe, has it in it. So that's on the EFI side of things. Raceback, their Sportsman Day Logger obviously has that. Their V300 has it. There are some other ones, like there's an RPM data logger. It's a little bit less expensive. That one has a G meter in it. Most of these other EFIs, you can add an external G meter to them. And, the G meter is more going to be used as a tuning aid, not necessarily like to fix where a car might be spinning at, but it's going to be used to help get it to move a little bit quicker and more efficiently through the application of power. So you'll see the G meter spike up, and some of the cars will pull, some of the, I don't want to say slower cars, but say like a 550 8-mile car, which I don't even know what that is, like an 80 car, something like that, 850 car. Those things might peak at, say 1.8 to 2.1 Gs. And they'll peak and kind of fall off pretty quick. And you can kind of get it to try to make it hold a higher amount of G longer by manipulating the power in the car. So you want to try to manipulate it in a way that it holds it, not necessarily as high as it can for as long as it can, because sometimes that means it's just going to be doing a big wheelie. But if you can get it to just hold it out longer or get there sooner, or you'll see peaks and valleys in it. If you can smooth all that out, it makes the car more consistent. There's a lot of information you can learn from a G meter. It really depends on if you're having a problem. It can help you, but sometimes they'll tell you you're having a problem that you don't even know you have yet.
So there's probably one more question that's come up one way or another here that we can talk to, and then we can give it in to wrap this up. Several questions talked about, when you're dealing with your locked in terms of geometry. Triangulated 4-link is obviously a big deal for a lot of the people that are listening in tonight, or as you guys were talking about with the torque arm and stuff. How should people approach where they need to start making changes in geometry from stock, and what is your advice for them to either research or ask questions of TRZ to decide, where do they need to be going with their combinations in terms of how they look at geometry? I'm just seeing a bracket go by here, which is a lower bracket for welding onto a housing, and it's got looks like 6 or 7 holes. What should people be doing at the most baseline, and how do they make those decisions? What do you recommend?
I mean, it's never going to hurt to have the adjustment, obviously. As far, there's multiple ways of doing it nowadays. You can do that lower bracket on the housing. Companies build 9 inches with those lower brackets and adjustable upper brackets, including ourselves. And then there's some frame mounted upper lower controller mounts that have multiple holes. There's all kinds of ways to do that. I suppose some people can get lost on the adjustment, but if you have the adjustment, you should be able to get the bar angles that you need for whatever ride height you're at. Like if you have stock stuff, you can only go so low until you're kind of screwed. As soon as that lower bar angle starts running downhill, you're if you want the car to be lower than that, you kind of have no choice but to get some lower brackets or raise the car back up. What your ride height of the car is going to be kind of determines what you should be getting for that kind of stuff, I guess. And power, obviously. If you're going to be making 1,500, 2,000 horse, just get the adjustment now and save yourself some time.
Right. Yeah. The power level plays a lot into where your angles are going to be. A lot of that is also assuming you have a really good shock. Then the weight plays into it too. So the lighter weight cars usually end up much heavier in the front because it's really easy to get weight out of the back of the cars when you start talking carbon fiber wheel tubs, carbon fiber floors and interiors and all that stuff. you get really light in the back. So if your car is really front heavy, you need to be a lot more aggressive with the angles. So when we talk aggressive, it's, again, looking from the side of the car, if the upper control arm is running downhill towards the front of the car, that, the more angle in it that way. So the more downward angle, the more aggressive the upper is. Same thing with the lower, but the opposite way around. The higher it is going towards the front of the car, the more aggressive the lower bar angle is. So higher powered cars, lighter cars, a combination of the two are going to have much more aggressive angles for the most part, especially when you're talking stock suspension. We do, this is an overgeneralization again, but a good starting point, if you're measuring angles and you have room to move it, is get the ride height where you want it. And we usually will shoot for an as measured angle on the upper control arm of somewhere between 10 and 15 degrees down. On a stock suspension car, we will measure that along the angle of the control arm, like along the control arm itself, not a side view, because that angle will be a little bit different. But if you just physically put a zeroed out angle finder on the control arm and you look for a number in that range, you'll be close. Same thing with the lowers. Our starting point, this again is all for drag radial stuff. Our lower control arm, we shoot for 3 to 5 degrees upwards on the lowers. That one's pretty easy to see, because it's, even though they're on a little bit of an angle, it doesn't make much of a difference on that part of it. But if you can get a car in those ranges, you can usually have something that can go down the racetrack, as long as you have a halfway decent shock on it. So, if you call us and you're like, the thing, made 1,400 to the wheel. I've got these angles all set up like this, but it's not going anywhere. And then we ask you, what kind of shock you have, and you say you have a Lakewood 9010, we're probably going to tell you need to spend a little money on some shocks, because that shock's going to be.
You cannot flip that around and make it a Lakewood 1090. It doesn't work.
If you put it upside down, it doesn't make it go the other way.
Wait a minute. Oh, damn. Oh, that would have been awesome advice, but okay, everybody down. Just
Exactly.
everybody knows.
Save your $1,800. That $20 shock, you got it. It's fine.
So, guys, were there any other major misconceptions or things that you guys wanted to touch on before we wrap up? I have to tell you, our audience engagement has been off the hook. Zillions of questions. We hope we've got to most of them.
Indeed.
Thank you so much for being here. Any other of those misconceptions or things, as the guys who sell incredibly successful suspension components, and I see, you guys are doing brakes, you're doing, a lot of the other components, that little things that can really cross people up when they're trying to work on their cars. What are the things, or those misconceptions you mentioned? What rings the phones, and what can you help people think about?
I think we covered probably, as we talked, more misconceptions than I was originally thinking about. I think most of everything that we were talking about, we got through. A big thing, like I said, instant center is not live or die. That's a big misconception in our book. Other people do live or die by it. They would fight us to the death on that. That's fine. They can do that. That one, we're not going to touch the physical instant center anti-squat thing. That's a big one.
We just go by bar angles.
Yeah, bar angles,
it matters, but the way we measure versus somebody else's.
Yeah, bar angles are definitely, in our book, easier to judge. That was really the biggest one that I wanted to hit on, but we did also come across a few things on some of the shock settings. What else? I don't remember offhand. There were 5 or 6 of them, and now I'm drawing a blank on what the rest.
I guess one more thing is rear shock settings, not settings themselves, but again, if you're going to have a car set up to separate like a radial, 5, 6, 7 inch stroke, whatever the shock is, you need to make sure it's fairly well compressed.
Oh yeah.
To have enough room to extend, because a lot of guys will get a 5 inch stroke and then they'll mount it there and they'll have 3.5 inches of shaft showing, and then they only have 1.5 inches to go till it tops out, and they'll fight a lot of issues until they figure that out. You don't really want to top a shock out. Hopefully if it does, you're far enough down track, but it can cause the car to get a little bit loose, or sometimes a wheelie. Yeah, I mean, it's, sometimes when it tops out, it'll either wheel stand or spin. Depends where on the track you're at. But, if you're setting up to separate, you want that shock pretty well compressed. It's not, don't worry about the compression. You're only using that on bumps on the track, things like that. You want an inch and a half showing, something like that. Even on a 7-inch stroke, you want to have all that available extension in case it's going to use it, but you don't want to risk stopping that shock out. That's kind of common. We come across that a lot.
Well, I hope everybody stayed around to listen to that particular piece of advice, because that's huge in terms of maintaining control of the tire and control of the car down track. Wow, this has been an amazing show, guys. Can't thank you enough. We're going to go to the rap music here in just a minute, but stay on with us for a little bit because we want to plan the next show. So if you can stay with us for a minute or two. For everybody in the listening audience, thank you so much for staying with us for 101 episodes. It's been amazing. We're humbled and honored that you've all been with us all this time. And we're going to stay with you and continue to bring you people as epic as Mike and Todd Braasch from TRZ Motorsports. So with that, Scott, take us out.
Done. We'll take care of it. Thanks everybody for listening. We appreciate it. That was awesome. My microphone was broke most of the night, so I ended up basically just taking notes here because I'm actually working on another radio car and I'm trying to learn suspension tuning. But thank you guys so much. Stick around for a few minutes so we can have a little after chat that's kind of worth sticking around for a few minutes. But thanks everybody, and we will talk to the rest of you listeners next Wednesday. Appreciate it. Not sure who we'll have on yet, but hopefully it'll be halfway as cool as the show we had tonight. Everybody take care, and we'll sign out.
Thank you.